Hey, it's your pal Mike Shea from the website Sly Flourish and author of the books The Lazy Dungeon Master and Sly Flourish's Fantastic Locations. I'm going to be hosting a brand new show on the Don't Split the Podcast network called the DM's Deep Dive. Each month, I'll be talking to a member of the D&D community about a particular topic of the game like encounter design, tools for improvisation, and game pacing. You can subscribe to the show through iTunes, on Twitch, or on YouTube. Join me, and we'll all work together to make our games fantastic.
This is Tabletop Babble. I'm James Introcaso. This week on the show, I'm talking with Chris Sniezak and John Arcadian about how big bad boss monsters can be awesome. These two game designers just put out the Book of the Tarrasque with Encoded Designs. It's over 80 pages of killer kaiju amazingness, so they're perfect for this topic. Let's get right into the good stuff. Here's my chat with them. Okay, everybody, now I am here with Chris Sniezak and John Arcadian, and we are going to be talking about awesome high-level monsters, specifically the Tarrasque. Guys, welcome to Tabletop Babble. Why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do in the industry? Chris Sniezak, let's start with you.
I'm Chris Sniezak, and I make a lot of podcasts, and I do a bunch of game design, and I do marketing, and I do layout, and I do pretty much whatever anybody will pay me to do and whatever I can do for the companies that I work for. So it's many varied tasks, basically.
Yeah, you are an amazing human being who does a ton for the community. Thank you so much for everything that you do. And of course, lovely podcasts that our listeners might know and love. And if you don't, go check out the Misdirected Mark podcast network. It's got a lot of awesome goodness on it. And check out Encoded Designs to see a lot of Chris's work. And of course, somebody else who is part of all of those projects is John Arcadian. John, welcome to Tabletop Babble. What do you do in the world of tabletop RPGs?
Thank you. Like Chris says, I wear many, many hats because that is kind of the way the industry works. Primarily, the most known thing I do is I am the head gnome over at Gnome Stew, keeping that running, bringing in a lot of guest articles and working with our staff gnomes. And then I do most of my game writing these days through Encoded Designs with Chris, but I still do a little freelancing or art direction for, a couple of other people. Still doing one or two things with Engine Publishing when they pull stuff out, one or two small things for Cubicle 7. And then I also do a lot of the game industry websites that are out there because that is my day job. And when people find out that I do web design, they're like, hey, I actually really need that.
Absolutely. And it is amazing what you have done over there with Gnome Stew. Gnome Stew is an amazing website and resource. I love to hear the phrase staff gnomes. That is the first time I've heard that in my life. So I'm super, super happy you are here. And of course, you have this wonderful book that you have just put out, the Book of the Tarrasque. Now, listeners probably already know the Tarrasque, D&D's most famous kaiju-style, enormous engine of destruction monster. So we're going to use that as a jumping-off point to talk about monsters. But give me a very brief overview. What is in this Book of the Tarrasque? It is amazing. It is incredible. You've got all sorts of alt rules and histories and that sort of thing. What do you get when you purchase the Book of the Tarrasque?
Yeah, there is a lot of stuff. And it was hard, as this kind of came about organically to say, what exactly should this be and what do we need this to be? Because this kind of started from just doing playtests and playing campaigns with the Tarrasque and a Tarrasque mini that I had acquired. And as I kept kind of modifying things or ran it for another one-shot or ran it at another convention, it was like, oh, okay, well, what else do you need? Or what else is interesting about the Tarrasque? So it has an expanded Tarrasque statistics section that kind of like breaks everything out into defense, attack, makes the immunities, easy to track, and adds in some extra things like regeneration. There are a bunch of 5e rules that bring in stuff from older editions from the 1e to 4e stuff, like regeneration, the trample, and then even some new stuff that I was like, hey, this would be cool to kind of throw players off their balance. Not that they wouldn't quite expect, the Tarrasque to have a ranged rubble throw. So we have that for 5e rules and advice. And then there is a care and feeding of adventures to your Tarrasque section, which is, all the general advice, tactics that people have brought up, tactics that people have proposed, how things work, a little kind of overview of will the sort of void bomb tactic work, or will, how do you actually kill it if you're using the sort of old school rules of it requires a wish? Are there other ways to deal with that? And then we kind of do some stuff with incorporating it into your game and a couple of plot seeds for, hey, here's an interesting new way to make a Tarrasque a component of your game. And then because the Tarrasque has been around for so long, we've got a history section that outlines every bit that I could find after intensive searches of, where's the mythological origins, where's it appeared in role-playing games, that are Dungeons and Dragons and aren't Dungeons and Dragons? Where is it an Easter egg in other different video games like StarCraft? And then, of course, Chris has written an incredible fun adventure that makes the Tarrasque the secondary threat, which is kind of awesome because it's like, yeah, you have to beat the Tarrasque, and then there's something worse.
Well, I love that, and I love everything about this book, and it's huge. We've got over 80 pages dedicated to one monster, which is really incredible. And then you've got all this great history. I think one of the things about the Tarrasque, as written in the 5e Monster Manual, is that people looked at it and they were a little like, oh, there's nothing new here. There's nothing exciting. It's a big sack of hit points that deals out a ton of damage, is hard to kill. It's got some iconic Tarrasque reflecting abilities. But other than that, right, there wasn't anything new or exciting. And part of that was good, right? Part of the promise of 5e was it's the D&D But I think people were a little disappointed, and this gives you ways that still taps into classic Tarrasque abilities to get it there. When you're designing an enormous monster like this, and Chris, maybe you can talk about it because we hinted at the even bigger bad in this book. What is it that you think a really big bad monster needs to have? And I'm talking about like almost, if not the very end of a campaign. We've got something, the party's facing it down, and this could be in any system, right? It could be in Fate, it could be in D&D, it could be in Pathfinder, it could be whatever. Everybody loves that big showdown. What do you give a monster to make sure that showdown pays off without wiping out the party entirely in the first round of combat?
Well, the first thing about these epic kind of gigantic or big bad Engai type monsters is what is the theme of the monster? So in the case of the Tarrasque, and I'll talk about a dragon in a second too, what does the Tarrasque do? It can destroy stuff. Like, it's actually really good at that. And right in its stat block, it can blow things up. So, like, easily. It does double damage against structures. So that should be a part of whatever encounters or whatever things that you're building, scenarios that you're building should have to do with that thing. Otherwise, you're not utilizing everything about your epic monster. So, for instance, in the Book of the Tarrasque, every encounter that you can run into the Tarrasque, it's got something to destroy that will affect the terrain of the situation. And if it does, usually it gets worse for the party. So that is a thing, like for the Tarrasque. If it's a dragon, dragons can fly. Like, we always do the thing with the dragons and the layers and whatnot, but how much better is it if you're trying to fight a dragon on top of a mountain and it can actually take off and fly around and do things? Like, if it can fly and it can breathe from distance, you should take advantage of those things in your encounter, especially in your final fights. The other thing that I like to do with especially these kind of epic fights to make them feel more epic is I steal from old JRPG tropes and make them tiered monsters. So I give them like multiple hit point bars. So when they run out of one set of hit points, then it's like that old bloodied thing from 4th edition. They do something else and they change a little bit, and then they have a new set of tactics and new set of abilities so that you have to figure that stuff out too.
I love that. It's almost like they start blinking red, right? And now they get this new charge attack or something like that. Is really great. And one of the things 4th edition did really well. John, what about you? You were given the Tarrasque back regeneration and stuff like that. Why do you think the Tarrasque needed those options?
A lot like Chris says, because I am right on board with the JRPG thing. Tarrasque has moved into its secondary form and now has wings and is flying in, on a cloud in a different dimension. The thing about these sort of big epic combats is not that like, oh yeah, you're facing off against the big bad who's a wizard or a cleric or somebody, who is on your scale. You can kind of conceptualize it. It's that very kaiju sort of nature of you're looking up and going, how do I even begin to tackle this? How do I even begin to take that on? And that's sort of what I like to play, around with in big monsters like these and other big monsters I've run in this and other systems. I was actually just watching today, which I had found in the videos, your Tome Show full take on of the Tarrasque. And it's kind of cool, the same thing you guys were doing in there is what I've seen from so many players when I've been playtesting this. Somebody's like, all right, I attack it with this. What do you mean my fireball doesn't work? Oh God, now I have to think and just that groan on the face while at face value, you think that's a groan and the players are annoyed, but they're like, I really have to think about this. I can't use the exact same tactics. So unique things that take it one order of magnitude away from a regular combat that force you to think about it in different and unique ways are what I think every big monster has to have. Another one of my favorites, and it's only a 10th level monster, I believe, the Genosphinx or the Androsphinxes are really cool because you can be like, oh yeah, no, it's this big giant sphinx with wings that has access to magic. Like, I often take and put an illusion on that so it looks like something different. All of a sudden people have to kind of like dig in and think, how do I actually defeat the mental aspect of this rather than attacking the big giant sack of hit points, like you mentioned. So doing things like that, making sure that player actions and player thoughts actually pay off. If they're going to put the mental energy into it, making that pay off and making that interesting for them.
I love both of these ideas, right? Chris, your idea of look at the stat block, and if it's got something, don't ignore that. Play to those strengths. Play to a burrow speed or the fact that it can destroy buildings easily. And I love what you're saying too, John. I think that idea of getting the player buy-in and reaction is so, so important. And along those lines, I do think like the introduction, when you first meet or hear about this creature are so important, right? The first impression, if you will, of the Tarrasque. How do you, and each first impression, right? The first time they hear about it, the first time they actually see it in action, the first time they try to fight it, how do you make those first impressions as incredible as they need to be so that even your power gamers who are at your table are kind of like, I don't know if we can take this thing on. The Tarrasque has the benefit of real world stories of, oh yeah, that killed our entire group, right? The Tarrasque already has this sort of meta mythos behind it when it comes to role-playing games. How do you do that, not just with the Tarrasque, but then also with maybe your own original kaiju, or maybe something that's not as big physically as the Tarrasque, but should be just as intimidating because of their mental or magic prowess? How important are those first impressions, and how do you pay them off?
One of my favorite things about first impressions with monsters is that aura of mystery about them. That kind of like, I was not expecting this, and now I have to rearrange all of my mental thought processes. In another game I ran in a non-D&D system, I had, a standard fantasy style adventuring party come across this thing they encountered called the Bell Ringer, and I had some mini that looked perfect for it, and it was like a big bully gorgon sort of thing, but it was holding this like lantern and bell, and by naming it the Bell Ringer, by them like encountering it, and all of a sudden everything they did just didn't work, and it just kind of like touching one of them and put them to sleep. They're looking at this thing going, oh, this is a big giant, a hairy Bigfoot sort of monster we have to kill. And then it is possessed of these incredible magics. It is this thing beyond their ken, in a very Lovecraftian way. They grabbed the party member that fell and ran. And then I said, oh, that was just going to be an encounter. Now he's the second in command for the whole thing. And making sure it has that aura of mystery, that sort of, unknown aspect to it, I think, makes players think about it and build it up into a much bigger thing in their head.
I like using the foreshadowing thing. John hits it really well with like how to like twist the trope or make it not feel like the thing that you think it's going to be and then being something completely different. I like to foreshadow stuff. So like, in the Tarrasque adventure, the first thing that they do is they roll into a town that was been destroyed by the Tarrasque. And there are a couple of scenes where they can actually encounter people who have dealt with the aftermath. So they get to see what the Tarrasque has done, and then they get to see how people feel, how some of these NPCs feel from what the Tarrasque has done to their home and how ineffective they were at it. So twofold thing right here. One, it sets a mood. Two, it actually provides some clues for what this thing does when they actually do have to deal with it. Another example, say you have like you're hunting down a wizard or some sort of magic using creature that is really adept at mind control or things like that. Then you have to start seeding those things early. Like, you run into somebody who is acting one way, and then like an adventure later, they're acting completely differently and maybe even hostile towards the party. And then you run into a town where the whole town has been mind controlled by this thing. And then eventually you run into the thing that's been doing all the mind controlling, and however the mind controlling works, they've had chances to find out what it is. So like if in this case, it's a insect mage, and they use these little worms that burrow into people to assert control over them. And if they found that out, then they have information. If they didn't find that out, then they're freaked out because they think it's one kind of magic and it's something completely different.
I like that. The idea of the build-up, the monster foreplay, if you will, right? Like that you're experiencing it as you grow, right? And that's very D&D. The more able you are to deal with the threat, the more of the threat you actually start to see. And so you see its influence on one person, then a whole town, then you might actually see the beast in the distance, but you got to run away because you're not powerful enough or you don't have the right weapon or artifact to take it on, right? I also like this idea of maybe some misinformation or not getting the whole picture. So, you meet somebody and they're like, oh, well, not much is known about the Tarrasque, but we know X, Y, and Z. And it's like, oh, okay, great. We'll kill it with fire then. And then, when you actually go up against it, wait, nobody told us it was immune to fire. Holy crap. I love those moments too, where it's like, you're getting the idea it's terrible, it's eating whole towns, but then it's even worse than you thought. That kind of payoff is really good, and you can build up to that payoff in those smaller increments, which is really cool.
It also pays off a different kind of story beat in your game instead of just fighting or the action part. It pays off the looking for information part of it too, because if there's information out there to be had, then it lets them know that taking the time to go look for that stuff actually matters in your game.
And you did beautifully with in the adventure for the gathering information. There's a whole section in there that I just loved. That was like, all right, you know the Tarrasque is there, but what do you actually know, and what's just rumor like that? And there is a way to find out, but that is a whole challenge in itself. That is not combat. That turns it into something really interesting, and takes this like very fun. Oh, we're going to fight the Tarrasque, but we have to be geared up for it,
And it's totally optional.
And let's talk a little bit about that, because I do think these are monsters we're talking about that you could build entire campaigns around, right? Yeah, it's fun to hear at level 17, oh, by the way, the Tarrasque just rose 3 towns over. Could you guys go take care of that? Sure, that could be a fun adventure. But an even more fun adventure is building up and taking all of that time. So how do we build entire campaigns around monsters, particularly ones like the Tarrasque that, are basically giant eating machines? Like the Tarrasque is an interesting villain in that it can destroy a lot of stuff, but it's maybe not the most cunning, right? It doesn't have a plan other than it's going to wreck some stuff up. So how do you make a big villain like the Tarrasque interesting?
One of my favorite things is to put the Tarrasque in the background, honestly, because that is sort of you are going to get to the Tarrasque, and that is a thing you are going to fight because, it's like Chekhov's Tarrasque. If you introduce the Tarrasque, players are going to want to fight it. But, it's like, let's make it an interesting part of it. Well, one of these sort of plot points I talked about that I really like, because now I want to run, of course, all these hundreds of plot sort of seeds using the Tarrasque is, there's been a necromancer lich who just took over a huge chunk of the world, and the Tarrasque grows. And you have gotten it to go attack through the lands of the undead, just countries full of, Mordor-like undead. Well, the Tarrasque can totally go waltzing into Mordor. So how do you get to the artifact that's doing this? You follow the Tarrasque's path of destruction. It is the only safe place that is not, hordes of undead, attacking you. So yeah, there's the Tarrasque, but it is no longer the sweet, let's go fight it. It's the, well, this is the secondary part. What else is interesting, and how does the Tarrasque change the landscape of the world?
So for me, I love Night's Black Agents because of the Conspiramid. And I think that thing works as a great structure for pretty much everything, especially if you just take the Conspiramid and turn it into just like kind of a web map of possible events and then have things react as you move along it. So what that means is if your bad guy, your big imposing bad guy is just a brute like the Tarrasque, then they should probably be some sort of tool or pawn or, gigantic, really formidable sledgehammer that the bad guy that is actually in charge is using. If your bad guy is actually a dragon or something really intelligent, then they're running their own network. They don't need to have a sledgehammer, although they could have them, and they should also have minions and lieutenants and all that good stuff too, because that is really kind of what makes a campaign in a lot of cases. And that's how you get that moving through the ranks. It doesn't even matter what kind of game you're playing. You could be playing Fate. You could be playing D&D. It doesn't even matter. That's like one of my favorite tools to use. So if it's something huge and really imposing, then it's about the legend, in my opinion. Like you have to start right in session 1, dropping the legend in the background somewhere at least. Or maybe even in the foreground. Maybe even give them something that relates to it, like that little piece of an artifact that they don't know what it is because they don't have enough money to buy an identify spell yet. Or maybe it is a magic item that does something, but it's part of something bigger. Like, that's the fantasy trope, right? The other side of it is like, it's part of a larger scheme. Like, if you've ever read the Dresden Files novels, the first 3 books are basically build up towards like the very, very bottom parts of the Conspiramid leading up to what is going on with the Black Council. So those are the kind of things that you should look for and try to emulate and model with your game.
And I think a lot of it's also what your players are really there for. If your players are there to just go kill a bunch of creatures, yeah, they're going to want to take on the Tarrasque. But I've rarely found, even in playing D&D, that there are many players who are like, I just want to kill all the things and go murder hoboing. They want something more to that. So the Conspiramid's a great sort of way. It's like, yeah, here's your big sledgehammer, but here's the other more investigative stuff you can do alongside of that.
I love that. And I love the idea of defending the Tarrasque. Like, that's such a great idea. Like, hey, we got to go into Mordor to get the thing that can kill the Tarrasque because that's where it is, right? And then maybe the bad guys have it and you've got to get it from them before they use it on the Tarrasque, because then you don't have a way out of Mordor, right? So you've got to stop the bad guys. You're defending the very thing you're there to end, which is kind of a cool idea. And Chris, this idea of seeding everything really early, I think does help build the legend of these massive creatures. I think this idea of a cult surrounding the Tarrasque specifically is a good one too, right? We see sort of these cults that come up, that worship these giant beings, which kind of makes sense, right? Like, they're as big as gods. They're there to maybe rule. We don't really know why the Tarrasque is destroying things. It just is. So we're going to follow this thing and try to appease it and help it by creating chaos, so that when it comes, its job to destroy is even easier. Do you guys like that idea of the cult of the Tarrasque, and also cults that worship these other bigger beings?
Absolutely, because it's in the adventure that I wrote. so there you go. Like, yeah.
Yeah, that was a setup for you.
Yeah, I do. Like, I mean, it's got a legend around it anyway. It's called the World Ender. So you can play on that idea. I love ideas of dragons that have gone beyond just being dragons. Like, they're more like godlike beings in a lot of cases, like Tiamat. Like, we had that already. There's the cult of the dragon. They all worship Tiamat in the Forgotten Realms. So, I mean, I've played on that idea in other games too. I mean, I love that kind of stuff, right? Like, super powerful beings that don't think like us necessarily, that are either, primal, or they are, beyond us in intelligence, and there are just things that worship them. Like mind flayers. I love me some mind flayers. Or aboleths. Like, they're already affecting the mind anyway, so they're also alien and crazy. So anything that worships them would also be really cool.
And cults make very interesting kind of adversaries because, you have any cult that's worshiping something like that, like mind flayers or something of alien origin, and they're just like, they're not operating by the same rules. It's not like you're going up against an army who wants to conquer. You're going up against a bunch of people who do not care. They are looking for the end of the world. How do you suddenly you're willing to do whatever? You don't really care about your lives because you are looking for the end of the world, It totally changes it from a direct, yes, we want to defeat the other army who have lives and things they want to protect and things they want to do. It's like, no, you're just crazy cultists. Great. We're gonna try to deal with you the way we do normal people. You kind of have to completely change your tactics.
And by the same point, I think that a monster like the Tarrasque also allows the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants to team up with the X-Men to take out Apocalypse, right? Maybe it's these unlikely allies that the players are finding, people that maybe they were fighting at the beginning of the campaign, and now it's like, well, now we got to band together or we're all dying, right? Or using the Tarrasque like a weapon, right, is the other thing that it could be. Like, maybe some king is like, well, the Tarrasque is an opportunity for us to go destroy yada yada. And then the players have to sort of make the decision to, are we going to try to take this thing out now? Or are we going to try to lead it across the ocean so that it can take out our enemies? What's the right thing to do with this atomic weapon?
In one of the campaigns I ran, in doing playtesting for this, I have the characters kind of wake up, dimensionally transport to this world, and accidentally free the Tarrasque. It was Lockworld, where the Tarrasque was, sent. It's like, no, we're sending it to this other dimension. And there were all these, countries there of differing alignments, differing, sort of ways. And a lot of their campaign was going from country to country and figuring out who they wanted to work with and how they could work with it. And they finally hit a breaking point when coming to a lawful evil country, they just said, no, we are going to take over the city-state, and that is what we're going to do. And then we'll just have that city-state's power to take on the Tarrasque, because they couldn't get that Brotherhood of Mutants for, with the X-Men teaming up. But I think in a real-life situation, you would suddenly find yourself doing that. Like, we all need nuclear weapons then because we need to take on the Tarrasque.
That's right. Like, oh, you have the Tarrasque. Well, we'll open up the 9 hells and we'll bring out Tiamat. I love that idea. That's so cool. Hey, everybody, taking a quick break so I can let you know about today's sponsor, Audible.com. For you, the listeners of Tabletop Babble, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. One book on Audible that I think our listeners would love is The City of Towers, Eberron, Dreaming Dark, Book 1 by the one and only Keith Baker, the man who made the setting himself. Check out that audiobook or go download any free book of your choosing at audibletrial.com/DSPN. Again, that's audibletrial.com/DSPN. All right, let's get back to the good stuff. This idea of history is within the Book of the Tarrasque. You have done your research, sir. This is worth the price of admission just to have all these stories about the history of the Tarrasque, honestly. And so, how important is that in generating ideas, looking back at the way other people have used a classic monster, or even if you're creating your own new monster, you can look back and say, wow, look at all this. How can this research help us?
So first of all, I'm just going to name drop real quick because Shannon Appelkline came out and said that was a very thorough and complete history of the Tarrasque. So that's out there. Just so everyone knows, Shannon Appelkline wrote Designers and Dragons. Second, I used that history section as a lot of reference points for writing the adventure that I wrote. The Cult of the Tarrasque that I used, the cult that wants to end the world, was drawn heavily from a lot of the pieces in there. So it's important to me that stuff exists so that I can see where it all comes from. John, you should probably go on from there. I just wanted to get that little bit in.
No, not until you talk about the pituitary gland.
Oh yeah, that's right. So that stupid adventure, it's the how the mighty have fallen or something like that. It's
How the Mighty Have Fallen.
Yeah, it's like a second edition adventure. I actually owned it at one point in time, and John was like, "There's that adventure with the pituitary gland where like some wizard wants you to go get it from the sleeping Tarrasque, and it's like a throwaway encounter. It's hilarious." I'm like, "Well, let's turn that into something real." So the Tarrasque, it regenerates. Like, why doesn't it regenerate in 5th edition? I don't understand. Thank God John decided to put it back in. The Tarrasque has a layer in the adventure that I wrote, and what it regenerates from, even if it's killed, is its pituitary gland is caught in this bubble of force. So even when the Tarrasque walks away, it just rips its own pituitary gland out of it and stays there because the Tarrasque can regenerate from whatever. And then if it goes and gets killed, it just regenerates from that again in like 7 days. So yeah, I totally used that in the adventure too.
And it's so great because it's like, wait, the pituitary gland? I mean, I guess it makes sense. It's, it's the regenerative sort of thing. It, deals with growth, but it's like the pituitary gland, not the heart. It's not where you would have gone. And and How the Mighty Have Fallen, that was one of the things. There was a wizard who wanted to make a spell of a higher level than anything else had, that had been done. And he needed a couple of parts. And one of them was the pituitary gland of the Tarrasque. Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of history out there. And that's one of the things I love about the Tarrasque. The moment, because I remember getting the Monstrous Compendium from a local bookstore when I was traveling up to a Ren fair. Like, we stopped along the way. I was a young kid. I got it out of this bookstore. And that was one of the monsters I kept coming back to. And I was trying to, like, parse through, D&D at the time. But it was like, wow, this thing is what, 30th level? Everything else is like 7th level. How do you deal with that? And it generates stories. Just being out there, being that almost unattainable goal is just, it breeds stories. And that's the beautiful thing about it. Every edition has so many different kind of stories and a slightly different take, on it. And when I was researching this stuff, I was just trying to find anything I could. And I was digging deep. I was looking through things. I was reaching out to people I knew who kind of like dealt with stuff or talked about it a bit. I came across the comic book, which is wonderful. It is a perfect idea of, sort of that like late 80s sort of feeling when it's like, oh yeah, hey, here's a comic book. And by the way, there's somebody giving birth in the background. Just so we have something more interesting to go for here.
Also, Elminster was the midwife.
That's awesome. Well, and those ideas, the pituitary gland and working with the Tarrasque in that way, I think bring me to another point is like, we need to get creative with these monsters sometimes, right? Like, we need to think beyond the build up your arsenal, kill the Tarrasque, cast the wish spell, and wish it dead. And I think, your book has a lot of suggestions as how to do that. I think the J.M. Perkins setting Salt in Wounds, right, is all about an economy based on an unkillable regenerating Tarrasque where people can, keep cutting it up for parts basically to sell and to make stuff is a really interesting idea. How do we think beyond what's already been done with these monsters? How do we break out of the history and the typical and really surprise our players with like, oh yeah, there's going to be a Tarrasque in this, but it's going to be in a way you've never thought about.
Martin Ralia on Gnome Stew back in the day had a series called, it was like The Way It Would Change the World or stuff. And he talked about how spells would change the world or how things would change the world. And I always remember thinking about that in terms of like, how would your village or hamlet or city be different if there was a dragon on the nearby hill? And that's sort of like economy altering, lifestyle altering effect of these monsters, is incredible because it is like, yeah, okay, cool. You've managed to kill the Tarrasque like Salt in the Wounds. What do you do now? Like, well, if you can't use a wish to kill it, if that's just not on the table and it's still regenerating, how do you make it, die? J.M. Perkins and I talked a little bit about this once the book was released, talking about it, and I saw Salt in the Wounds about 2 months after I started deciding to write this up as a book from all my playtesting stuff. And I'm like, oh, that's going to be so perfect. Like, that is going to be great to just like fall right into that because I cannot wait to play that campaign. I just want to get people ready for it and actually kill the Tarrasque and do like a legacy campaign. There's been people talking online about different things like that. Like, one of my favorite pieces of headcanon is that in a similar way, people ate the flesh of the Tarrasque and became trolls. And that's where trolls come from. And those are the sort of incredible, how would these, sort of magics and incredible monsters alter the ecologies of the world?
So a lot of us like playing fantasy games, and especially Dungeons and Dragons, and I especially love Dungeon World. It's one of my favorite games. I took the idea of the dragon. I'm like, well, I've never really done a dragon hunt, not in a really long time anyway. So I'm like, let's do a dragon hunt. And I was like, well, what does this dragon want? How can it be more than just your typical dragon sitting on its sword being all smug-like? And I was like, well, there's like this mythology of dragons that like to sleep on these hoards after they get so much money so they can grow bigger. Like that's out there. That idea is out there somewhere so they can become more powerful. So I'm like, what if this dragon has already been the most fierce dragon ever? What does it want then after that? Well, it wants to become a god. So it goes to sleep in its lair, and it's been missing for a whole bunch of years because what it's doing is that it's drawing evil creatures to it and then hopefully luring adventurers to its lair, which is this whole giant little mountain range. And anybody who dies inside of there, aside from the money that they get, their souls get sucked into it too. So it's a giant soul collector, including the evil things that come there too. Also, this is like a place where the border between realities is weak. So it's actually trying to eat old, forgotten, considered dead gods and absorbing their essence too. So it's turning into this massive nightmare creature that will exist on the world. And that is the example. The ideology is like, take your monster, figure out some of the like little mythologies about it. Like, what does it want? What does it care about? And then turn those up to 11 or take that to the next logical step. Like, what does it want? It wants power. Well, what does that mean? And then answer those questions. Then you have your big bad end guy and where they're going in a new and interesting different place, because your answer will not be the same as somebody else's answer. And if you want, just go ask somebody else too. And you can see how different your answers will actually be. That is the methodology to do that. Then you can actually build whole campaigns around that ideology, because you're taking these monsters which are already terrifying and turning them up to 11, basically.
That's the Airy Peaks stuff, right, Chris?
Oh, that's totally the Airy Peaks.
Yeah. And those are fun, incredible games. I played in a couple of the Dungeon Worlds you've run for those at Queen City Conquest.
Yeah, I've actually finished the 3-year campaign that we played, and it'll be a book eventually. Hopefully the later part of this year. But yeah, just the ideology there. It's solid. I think it's great. I think it's transferable. I've used it in a couple other places on a smaller scale.
Oh, I love that. That is like a great idea. And this idea of one creature turning into something else works with that flip that we were talking about too, right? Like you haven't heard everything about the Tarrasque. Well, maybe you do know everything about the Tarrasque or whatever monster it is that you're facing. And that's because it's spent years sleeping underground and now it can breathe fire, right? Or now it is almost a god and a terrible nightmare creature. So there's a lot of really great stuff you can do with that.
In the lore and the adventure, I put a thing in there. Every time it's been killed, it comes back with new powers because it's getting tougher. Like it's adapting to the fact that it keeps getting killed.
Well, one of the best things I've thrown on a set of players is the Tarrasque suddenly had lightning breath, and they're like, "What? How does that happen?" And I explained to them kind of how I worked it, and they're like, "Okay, cool, yeah, no, that makes sense." And then one of them got hit with the lightning breath, and his fly spell went away. They're like, wait, the lightning breath is a dispel magic? And it all came from the fact that somebody couldn't kill him, but they could imprison him. So they put these shackles around his legs that were dispelling his magic constantly and keeping him held in this one place. But, the Tarrasque has magic resistance. Something about its innate nature was rubbing off on that. And so when it would shoot this lightning breath, yeah, the little bit of the dispel magic came along too. It kind of rubbed off wrong. So, just players, the looks on their faces going, wait, this is not at all what I prepared for. I have to switch tactics right now. Is wonderful. It keeps it fun and interesting.
Yeah, it really does. And it plays to that idea Chris was talking about too, that each time something dies, it becomes back more powerful. There's a Spider-Man villain during the pretty terrible Brand New Day storyline. If you read Spider-Man, but there's a villain who every time this villain dies, it comes back to life and it can't be killed the same way that it died. And that's kind of a great idea that like maybe then the players have to go back and research all of the ways this big bad evil guy has died and then say like, okay, so now we got to think of a new way we can kill it. We've killed it with fire and thunder and lightning and swords. And what's our way? How do we do it? And go from there, which could be really cool.
And then it becomes do we want to kill it? Or if it's going to keep coming back, can we contain it? Like, can we can't destroy this. Can we actually contain the damage it's going to do? And, like Chris said, shove it onto somebody else's doorstep. Like, enjoy it. Your problem now.
Yeah, that's very true, right? That wraps up a lot of what we've been talking about. What do you do with it if you do manage to kill it? I think is a great plan. Oh man, I love these big, amazing bosses and these big, crazy boss monsters. So, final question: what happens in the final showdown? Right, it happens. We're fighting the Tarrasque. We've killed the Tarrasque. How do you wrap things up from there?
That is a good question, because you can kind of move on to something. Like I'm a fan of doing a sort of legacy game. Like what happens years from now. How, what's the effect of the world now without the Tarrasque in it? Was it the thing that was keeping the peace between countries because they're like, no, we're not going to bother attacking our neighboring country. We need to be able to fight the Tarrasque when it comes around in another 15 years. So I think kind of, if you have killed the Tarrasque, that is probably the capstone to your career, unless you're going off into the epic tiers of like, well, let's take on the gods.
The super epic
gods
tier.
Ourselves. Right. Like, we made our own Tarrasques, whatever. But yeah, I think it's definitely like, yeah, all right, how does that affect the world? Let's play out that next story of what the world is changed. And I know, Chris, you talked about this a little bit in the aftermath sort of section. What would you do if, when you run a Tarrasque game, what would you do afterwards?
Well, there's a lot of things that you can play off of after that. I think my favorite idea is you get our book, you play that, and you use that adventure in the background, and then you get Salt in the Wounds, and you just, play J.M. Perkins' thing, because, he took the time to actually write a whole thing for it, and it, like James mentioned earlier, it's pretty cool. Other things that can happen, just think about the social impact, the socioeconomic impact of having a Tarrasque that's dead. Like, is that kingdom destroyed? Are they going to start getting invaded by outside places because they just had something wreck part of their infrastructure? Like, they don't have roads anymore. They can't move their armies around as quickly. And I know you're like level 15, 16 adventurers, but, dealing with an army, you just did deal with the Tarrasque, but dealing with the Tarrasque and dealing with an army might be two different things, because they can be in multiple places at once, armies. They can split up and such, or there could be more than one army. That's one thought. What happens to that giant creature or whatever the thing that you just killed, in this case, the Tarrasque? Like, can you harvest it for parts? Are those parts important? Are they a resource like in, Pacific Rim? Like, Pacific Rim's a really great resource for figuring this stuff out, how there's like a secondary market for these kaiju parts. It plays into that Salt in the Wounds thing too, but like, it's a slightly different take on it. Does the Tarrasque regenerate? Does the Tarrasque just die and then a new one pops up somewhere? Like, what does it mean when the Tarrasque dies? That's a question that you need to answer for yourself. And those are pretty much the things that I was thinking about and that I wrote about when I put that together. And that translates to everything else. Like, what do you what happens when your big monster that is imposing its will upon the world dies? Like, what does that mean for the world? Answer that question. You should be good to go.
Well, yeah, and like when Smaug died in The Hobbit, that's one of my favorite metaphors for that. Is like, all of a sudden there's a battle of 5 armies, because they're like, yep, there's not that monster looming over us now. How does that change things? Who suddenly got, putting on their big country britches and saying like, hey, it's time to go conquer everybody else.
Right. Yeah. We immediately go back to killing each other now that this thing is gone. Right. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today to talk about the Tarrasque and big bad evil guys. Tell us a little bit more about the book and where people can find it and check it out. It is wonderful. It definitely has my stamp of approval. 6 out of 5 stars.
Thank you very much. So you can find the book on Drive-Thru-RPG right now, and we're just finishing up the print version. Testing and making sure all the colors will print okay through Drive-Thru Source. So you can find it on Drive-Thru-RPG in PDF, and then in probably about a week in print. Yeah, we tried to give it a little something for everybody. Even if you're like, man, I don't think I want to run the Tarrasque. Oh wait, here's everything I need to do that.
Can I mention just one more thing? If you like playing games online, like John went the extra step. There's like an interactive packet in the back of this thing that you get with the PDF. It has like all the digital maps, and they're really nice maps that John put together. It's got a a printout or just use it on your digital table of a large PC Mini if you have somebody who likes to cast growth or whatnot. And it's got a Tarrasque Mini that you can print out, fold, and put on stock. Because John didn't talk about the part where he's really good at props, and he gives a whole bunch of tips about how to make this stuff and to do cool things for your game.
And that is one of the things about a Tarrasque game. It is a big showpiece game. Like, you want to make it visually appealing. You want to use props. You want to, like, you know, go borrow the wargaming tables at your local gaming store and be like, hey, I'm going to run this here with this giant, you know, Godzilla mini I just bought from the toy store. But yeah, we definitely tried to put a lot of stuff in there to do that. Like the maps, we have optimized so that you could actually print them out if you want to. I think 32 pages is the size of one of the maps you have to print out, but you can go find like a plotter printer at like a Kinko's or a Staples and print it out that way. But, you know, yeah, for online games too, like we've tried to optimize it so, hey, here's the miniature we can use and drop right onto our Roll20 tabletop, you know, and represent it that way.
I love that. And it is one of my favorite parts because I play on Roll20 all the time. So it's great to have that resource there. And that miniature in the back is really, really fun. It's really hard to find a Tarrasque Mini. So it's great that it comes with the book. And it's great that it's to scale because one of the best things about miniatures is plopping down an enormous one next to a tiny player miniature.
Oh, the looks on their faces. That's great.
Yeah.
Wait, you mean I have to fight that? My mini fits in its mouth. Why? Why does that happen?
As it should be. You should fit in the Tarrasque's mouth. That is to scale. That is to scale. Well, gentlemen, where can people find you on the internet? Chris, let's start with you.
The Light 101 on Twitter or at Misdirected Mark. I respond to that all the time. Email me at Chris at Misdirected Mark. Facebook, I'm Chris Sniezak. G+, I am Chris Sniezak. Those are the best ways to get a hold of me. Also, just, you know, leave comments on misdirectedmark.com or Encoded Designs.
Excellent. Great companies that you should be listening to podcasts from, buying the products from. And of course, you should also be going over to Gnome Stew, which is where I imagine people can find you, John, and where else?
Yeah, Gnome Stew is where I spend a chunk of my time, you know, doing stuff there. So anything that goes to Gnome Stew usually probably goes through me. But yeah, John Arcadian is a fairly unique name. So if you Google that, you will find me. I'm John Arcadian on you know, Twitter, on Facebook, you know, on the web. It is usually me unless it is my doppelbro, but that's usually only on YouTube. But also, Joe the Tarrasque. You should be following Joe the Tarrasque because Joe is a Tarrasque who works in demolitions and he's out there on Twitter just, you know, talking about his daily life.
Yeah, that is a super delightful Twitter account. People should definitely follow that. It's been really, really fun to see what the Tarrasque is tweeting. Go, Joe. Hopefully you don't come eat me. That would be great. All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me on Tabletop Babble today. Whew. That was a killer kaiju conversation. You know, Tabletop Babble is still a new show, and the best way to help it grow is to help others find it by leaving us a 5-star review on iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever your pod-catching platform of choice is. To encourage you to do just that, I'm reading one new 5-star review verbatim each episode and crediting the person who left it. You can make me say anything you want. Today's review comes from Nixie262. Nixie262 says, as someone who has been in and out of gaming since the late 70s, and most recently re-engaging in the hobby with my son, your podcasts have been incredibly helpful in catching up with the inner workings of the industry. Who is writing the good stuff, insights into products I like, the convention scene, how to be a better player and DM, etc. Always useful and entertaining. And if you bring back something from your past life, an updated version of Behind the DM Screen would be very, very cool. Thanks. So Nixie262, who left this interview entitled Entertaining and Informative, I am going to encourage you to check out the DM's Deep Dive with Mike Shea. That is similar to Behind the DM Screen, although we don't want to step on the amazing Tome Show's toes. But definitely go check out DM's Deep Dive with Mike Shea. You'll get more awesome DM advice. Okay, people, you can find out about everything I do at worldbuilderblog.me and on Twitter at James Introcaso. Tabletop Babble is a show on the Don't Split the Podcast Network. Special thanks to Rudy Basso for founding it with me. Our theme music, which you're listening to right now, is provided by Battle Bards. Until next time, remember that RPGs are like sex. If everyone's having fun, you're doing it right.